Welcome to today's Explainer. We're jumping right in. And today, we're peeling back the layers on something that's profound, a little unsettling, and honestly, absolutely fascinating. We're looking at human conflict. We're going to break down the deep psychological engines behind why we fight. And I promise you, by the time we wrap this up, you're going to look at everything from massive global historical events right down to that incredibly annoying argument you had at the office yesterday in a completely different light.
So let's just dive straight into the core of the issue. Why do we actually need to fight against each other? I mean, think about it for a second. We live in this world that considers itself so civilized, right? We build magnificent cathedrals, world-class universities, breathtaking museums. Yet at the exact same time, we're continuously building weapons, raising armies, and drawing up battlefields. And even in times of so-called peace, we're still actively creating enemies in our everyday lives. We're projecting hostility onto our neighbors, our colleagues, or just random strangers on the internet. Why does this impulse just stubbornly persist?
Well, for centuries, we love to tell ourselves this really comforting fairy tale. You know the one, the myth of the noble savage, living in absolute peaceful harmony with nature until modern society came along and ruined everything. But modern archaeology violently shatters that myth, a staggering 20%. To put that into perspective, that is the percentage of skeletons in certain prehistoric cemeteries that show clear, undeniable signs of a violent death. We're talking fractured skulls, arrow marks, early settlements surrounded by heavy defensive walls. War wasn't some tragic exception introduced by modern society. It was a terrifying, everyday reality of our ancestral past.
But why? It wasn't always just a desperate scramble for food or territory. The anthropologist Pierre Clastres came up with this wildly counterintuitive theory. He suggested that for many early pre-state societies, external conflict was actually a deliberate structural tool, and they used it specifically to prevent the centralization of power. By keeping the group in a constant state of mobilization against an outside enemy, it basically stopped a dominant tyrannical elite from rising up within their own ranks. So war, paradoxically, was used as an instrument of internal social balance. Crazy, right? Now, what's really interesting about this is how it sets up a foundational philosophical tug of war. On one side, you've got Thomas Hobbes. He famously declared that man is a wolf to man. He believed our natural default state is driven by fear and constant competition, which makes war inevitable unless we're controlled by some strong authority. On the flip side, you have Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who argued the exact opposite. He thought primitive man was inherently peaceful, but then institutions and private property came along and bred conflict. Yet, despite being total opposites, both of them ultimately recognized one dark truth. The desire for domination, once it's sparked, takes very deep root in the human heart. Okay, let's peel back the psychological layer here. Sigmund Freud looked at human civilization and saw it as this perpetual, exhausting wrestling match between two massive biological drives. In one corner, you have Eros, the impulse for life, love, connection, and union. And in the other corner, Thanatos, this innate, undeniable itch for destruction. Freud argued that this destructive drive doesn't ever actually disappear. We just stuff it down, repress it, until it inevitably explodes into acts of intolerance, violence, or even war. It's basically a psychological pressure cooker. Which brings us to the absolute centerpiece of our explainer today. Carl Jung's concept of the shadow. The shadow is essentially the collection of all our unacknowledged dark aspects. It's our fears, our completely unacceptable desires, our deepest insecurities, all the things our conscious mind absolutely refuses to accept about ourselves. But Jung pointed out something crucial. If we don't recognize these hidden parts, they don't just magically vanish. No, they hide out in our unconscious. They gain strength, and they constantly look for a way out. And here is exactly how that hidden shadow breaks out into the real world. It's a very logical step-by-step mechanism. First, it starts with repression. We bury all those dark traits we despise in ourselves. But, like we just said, they need somewhere to go. So, step 2, we project them outward. We find someone else and we make them the receptacle for our own hidden flaws. And once they're carrying our darkness for us, step 3 becomes incredibly easy. We dehumanize them. We convince ourselves they are the literal embodiment of evil. And suddenly, violence feels totally justified. War is quite literally the externalization of our own unacknowledged internal battles. This actually perfectly echoes Friedrich Nietzsche's profound observation. He noticed that human morality is very often born entirely out of resentment. Think about it. When we feel powerless or inferior, we try to mask it with moral superiority. We start blaming all the evils of the entire world on the other. So hatred isn't just a blind reaction. It's a tool.
It's a highly sophisticated psychological trick we play on ourselves so we can look in the mirror and see someone pure, someone righteous, while conveniently offloading all our darkness onto a scapegoat. There's just a deep, undeniable psychological comfort in having an enemy to blame.
So, if we all walk around with this glaring psychological vulnerability, who is taking advantage of it? Enter Michel Foucault. Foucault realized that power structures, like the state, the media, the educational system, they actively weaponize discourse. They aren't just controlling resources, they are organizing our language. They are the ones defining who we are and who they are. Ultimately, they create a specific symbolic field that takes all of our deep, unconscious anxiety and aims it directly at a highly specific target.
And in today's world, this process is absolutely on steroids. The platforms we carry in our pockets amplify the shadow projection like never before in human history. We're trapped in algorithmic bubbles that literally run on our anger because, well, anger drives engagement. Political rhetoric gets completely stripped of any nuance, and viral hate campaigns fragment us in an instant. We are being force-fed a diet of discourse that is specifically designed to supercharge our shadow. It's weaponizing our innate, desperate desire for psychological relief. All of this creates what sociologist Zygmunt Bauman might recognize as a Manichaean lens. It's this absolute aggressive erasure of all complexity. We just tell ourselves, we are the virtuous, we are the enlightened ones, and they are the ignorant and the dangerous ones. And let's be honest, it feels incredibly good, doesn't it? It is an intoxicating relief to just reduce complex human beings into flat caricatures that simply need to be defeated. Historically, this exact mechanism has justified everything from systemic persecution all the way up to full-blown atrocities. It frames violence as a comforting act of purification. Now, I want you to really focus on this next point because it's a real game changer. The battlefield has migrated. It's on your smartphone, and it is in your living room. We generally tend to think of war as something that happens far away, in trenches or across distant geopolitical borders. But this massive historical and psychological concept, it is playing out in your daily life, right now. The exact same archaic impulses that ignite global conflicts are sitting in your pocket, and they're sitting right at your dinner table. Okay, let's dive into this invisible war in our own lives because it is everywhere. It's that corrosive workplace rivalry where you try to symbolically annihilate a colleague just to prove that you're right. It's that veiled, passive-aggressive family struggle for control over the holidays. It's in romantic resentments where the goal completely shifts from actually understanding your partner to simply defeating them in an argument. It is the exact same archaic impulse scaled down to everyday life. Even the toxic validation seeking we see on social media, it's entirely driven by that exact same logic of us versus them. So, what's the end result of all this constant symbolic warfare? Honestly, it's an emotionally exhausted society that is permanently on high alert. We are just constantly scanning our news feeds for the next enemy, treating every minor difference of opinion as some sort of existential threat. This invisible war severely deteriorates our mental health, it completely corrodes our authentic social bonds, and it makes real collective building nearly impossible. What starts as the comfort of conflict very quickly turns into a psychological prison. So, how do we break the cycle? To figure that out, we have to pivot back to Carl Jung, who gave us this chilling yet incredibly empowering warning. He said, "What does not become conscious manifests as fate." As long as these deep psychic forces remain hidden and unacknowledged within us, humanity is just destined to blindly repeat its cycles of division and hostility. If we actually want a different outcome, we have to make the unconscious conscious. We literally have to stop looking at the external world as the source of all our problems and start looking inward. Winning this inner battle really requires a radical shift in how we operate. It starts with step 1, simply observing your own reactions. Pause the next time you feel an intense, overwhelming urge to humiliate someone online. From there, it requires the radical honesty to acknowledge your own dark impulses, accepting the uncomfortable truth that you too carry the seeds of intolerance. Only after you do that can you actually practice active empathy, where you listen without loading your mental weapons. Ultimately, this allows you to integrate your shadow, so you simply no longer need to project it out onto the world. But, this can't just be a solo project. We have to cultivate collective peace by actively reforming those very institutions Foucault warned us about. That means doing things like embedding emotional intelligence and peace education right into our schools. It means intentionally creating spaces that reward authentic, open dialogue instead of just algorithmic outrage. We have to actively question hate speech and the lazy stereotyping that constantly fuels that us versus them machinery from the ground up. Which brings us to the ultimate takeaway for this explainer. The greatest enemy is not out there. The greatest enemy is the ignorance we have of ourselves. Realistically, we are probably never going to eliminate conflict entirely. It's just woven too deeply into our biology and our history. But we absolutely can manage it maturely. We can disarm the destructive mechanisms of war by looking inward, by finally realizing that the threat we see is so often just a mirror, reflecting our own unintegrated darkness. I want to leave you with a final, provocative thought to chew on. What patterns of conflict do you recognize in your own life? Where are you fighting an invisible war right now? I challenge you to look really closely at your everyday interactions and just ask yourself what part of your own shadow might actually be driving the battle. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep learning, keep questioning, and I'll see you next time as we continue to unpack the fascinating frameworks that shape our world.